Well, good afternoon and welcome to what is now the first episode of what we're calling MedTech Crossroads. This is the rebranding of what we started out about 3 months ago calling COVID Connect. And we were so proud of the community, how it came together to talk about just the issues that it was facing. First, it was personal protective equipment and ventilators. And then we started to take a focus onto diagnostics. And now the conversation is shifting as the country and the state get back to work. We want to bridge towards topics. We're not running away from the question of COVID. That's still going to be a large focus. But this starts to bridge into bigger things. We want to talk about how it affects us. So we're going to talk today in just a little bit with a special guest talking about non-invasive dentistry as the dentists come back online. We're going to give you a little bit of a reflection on the emergency use authorization process and how that has compared to other historical FDA processes, some of which we'll be getting back to in daily life. And I wanted to share a really fun success story that was just shared with me about an hour ago. And hopefully we can get David Sarment on one of these coming weeks. But just today, Zoran Technologies announced a partnership with Make Medical. Of course, they were with us on the show as they were getting things together for the Vent MI. This, of course, coming out of University of Michigan, and former Governor Snyder had been part of that effort. But just got a note from David Sarment just before the show saying that they have now a distribution agreement in place with his thanks for getting everybody connected on that. So all of your efforts in coming together, one more thing that we can say came out of that. So that was very exciting. We promised last time when many of us were discussing on the show what future directions would look like that we wouldn't stop talking about the emergency use authorizations and about COVID as news comes up. So I want to start with that really quickly. And the first thing is to cover the emergency use authorizations. This is the master list that FDA maintains. And we'll just do a quick check-in here. Not a lot has changed. But in terms of in vitro diagnostic products, the list is now up to 88 entries long. So that keeps going up by a few every week. We were privileged to have Brandon McNaughton and Ying Pottinger on the show at various points talking about these different types of tests and how many tests you need to be able to get a true picture. There's now 35 high complexity molecular lab tests. And just coming online now are, of course, the fabled antibody tests. And we're not necessarily seeing a lot here yet for that, but that's, of course, to look at whether you've had SARS-CoV-2. Under PPE, there's no new entries since our last time together, but you'll recognize some familiar ones there. Of course, the vaporous hydrogen peroxide, gowns, other apparels, many decontamination systems, and then, of course, to where it all started, things like face shields and masks. On the ventilator front, we didn't check in on Appendix B here. We can take a quick look at Appendix B, but there hasn't been a terrible amount of things happening. Here's Appendix B, ventilators that have been cleared, and if we scroll down, we're going to get to some more recent dates. You can see it's just been a boatload of ventilators that got authorized under the EUA process. We're still in May on this list. Look at this, and here we go. We do have some new ones here as of June 1st. So NASA has an emergency ventilator, and look at this. Fitbit got into the action. Fitbit Flow. So they did this, and of course you're not going to buy this as a health and wellness device. It's for use by qualified trained personnel only when another one isn't available. But some of the latest entries to the ventilator EUAs. On the tubing connectors, of course, our friends at Make Medical, Vent MI, now supported by Zoran Technologies there. And then more recently, there are more connectors that have gotten out there. Bloom Energy, the latest one for a ventilator sharing system. So that's some of the latest news on the EUA front. One more point I wanted to make, and this is going to come back later in our show today, is that it's not all tests and PPE. But in fact, there are other things that are getting cleared. I wanted to draw just a little bit of attention to that. There's a right ventricular assist catheter. There's some predictive screening tools. There are some infusion pumps that have gotten emergency use. So lest you think that EUAs were all about fitting into exactly one category, here's a nurse call system approved about a month ago, or authorized about a month ago. It is possible under these emergency situations to say, hey, here's something that the healthcare workers need, and to go out there and get an emergency use authorization for it. And so we're seeing some of those. We haven't had a chance to focus on that in previous weeks, but I thought you might be interested to know that it hasn't all been diagnostic tests, PPE, and ventilators. So hopefully that's of interest. I want to stop that share right now. And without further ado, I want to invite our good friend, Stephen Bloembergen, who is the chairman and CEO of Greenmark Biomedical, on. Full disclosure, Intubing and Greenmark have worked together. But the reason I asked Stephen to come on today is as we go to what does the future look like, dentistry is one of those industries that's, I mean, you're right there in people's faces, and the chance for exposure is high. And so the thought process as to how are we going to deal with this is high. And because Stephen and Greenmark work with a lot of experts in the dental field, I thought it'd be fun to have Stephen come talk to us about how he sees, because he's exposed to this industry, how he sees this industry responding. And we're looking forward to hearing from you, Stephen. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Gene. Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Oh, it's disabled still, Gene.
Oh. You would have thought we would have learned this by now. There we go. Stephen, it's over to you.
All right. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Very good. Well, hi, everyone. And Gene, thanks for having me on. And let me start out by qualifying, saying that I'm not a dentist. So anyone listening to what I have to say may want to double check any new learnings they get from me today. So even though we all have very diverse backgrounds and we're constantly learning, it's of course upon all of us to be discerning about scientific development. And so what's Greenmark Biomedical? It's a fairly young new company. We were founded in 2016. And at Greenmark, we're going after the world's most prevalent chronic disease called dental caries or tooth decay. So most lay people don't actually know it's a disease. They, sometimes say, well, what are you carrying? And so we deal with this all the time. And so I think one way to solve this is to call it strep tooth. Then everyone would at least understand it's disease. So by way of introduction, given the diverse audience we have, Gene, I think in this presentation, I'll first talk a little bit about the aspects of dentistry and dental caries. And then we will speak to what I've learned personally about the impact of COVID from some of our advisors and people we've talked to. And finally, talk about what we at Greenmark are doing in this context. So in terms of significance, over $200 billion are spent globally on dental caries and its complications. Meanwhile, the management of caries has begun to move away from predominantly surgical to a more medical approach. And this leading journal is an expert review on non-surgical treatment of carious lesions. Yet surprisingly, there are no effective ways to monitor the success and impact of treatment. So the minute we drill into a patient's tooth, this of course begins an irreversible restorative cycle. And as long as we eat sweets or don't brush our teeth at least twice a day, or have a predisposition to caries, this will probably never go away. But fortunately, there is a growing philosophy that's now taught in dental schools that focuses on preserving enamel. So cavities begin with a white spot, which is an area of demineralization, initial demineralization of the enamel. And this can be arrested using fluoride products that are applied by the hygienist. So it's obvious that if you could identify an active white spot lesion and then stop its progression to a fully developed cavity, that this could be quite impactful. Dental professionals can then go ahead and repair that early white spot. But the problem is that there are no good ways to detect caries early, and non-invasive treatments are still in their infancy. So the benefits of minimally invasive dentistry are not being realized. So cavities begin with a white spot, and that's what we're trying to develop to go to the next stage. It's also called an incipient lesion. As I said, there's an area of demineralization or porosity of the enamel that starts well before a cavity actually forms. Of course, as things then progress, from there on, things become more painful over time. But did you realize that x-rays are actually not useful when it comes to finding things early? So bite wing radiographs have long been used, and dentists know that a small shadow on the x-ray means that things are typically more advanced. For example, for detecting lesions between the teeth, which is called interproximal lesions. See this left arrow, and that's where x-rays are believed to work well. Or on the biting surface, see the right area called the occlusal surface, where x-rays are limited due to the different thicknesses of enamel and then the underlying root structure. So in this situation, this tooth was actually extracted, then cut in half, and the decay was stained, revealing that the tiny shadows on the x-ray corresponded to decay into the dentin for the interproximal lesion on the left, and deep into the pulp for the occlusal lesion, all the way down the middle of the tooth. So no wonder this was extracted. This tooth obviously caused severe pain. Excuse me. So the author of this article, John Featherstone, challenged the status quo by saying, we need methods that detect lesions while they are still in the enamel so they can be reversed or arrested by remineralization treatment. Now, I'd like to shamelessly share with you some excerpts from a recent keynote presentation by one of Greenmark's advisors, who is a globally recognized cariologist. This is Dr. Dominic Zero. And Don was so nice to let me use some of his slides. So Don was telling us 6 weeks ago already that in the post-COVID-19 era, when this market returns to the new normal, we will need to deal with concerns over aerosols from high-speed handpieces, the drills that the dentists use, that can, of course, spread airborne viruses. So while dentists are, of course, doing what they can to appropriately address this issue, it also means that non-invasive strategies become more relevant, as well as always, oral hygiene and diet. So, but these last two are typically a bit more of a challenge to implement due to compliance issues. And therefore, we believe innovation is key here. So you've probably heard it all, but also in dentistry, extensive use of PPE and all kinds of special dental measures like rubber dams. Many dentists don't like to use, but they have it all available, and now they're using it all at once. So this is obviously going to slow dental procedures down.
I was going to say, if there's one industry that knew how to use all this PPE, it was probably our dental friends.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're very accustomed to it, and now they have to suit up even more. So, you know, this will always remain important to have surgical procedures. But this impact of COVID is that it'll be less efficient and therefore become more costly. And as a result, we expect that COVID may start tipping the scales in favor of prevention, as influenced by the risk-benefit and cost-benefit ratios, and of course, patient preferences, leading, oddly enough, to an overall improved oral health outcome as a result of the situation that we're currently finding ourselves in. These are some of the key aspects of early detection and assessment. Currently, early stage lesions are simply missed or found too late. And the most common thing is the visual tactile exam. The visual exam, of course, misses lesions that are typically more than 0.5 millimeter in size. The sharp metal dental explorer can cause cavitation and has been reported to do so. And as we saw, x-rays don't let us see lesions until they are well advanced. So newer technologies have led to methods and devices to attempt to aid the dentist with improved detection, but these newer devices have not significantly improved the ability to detect early stage tooth decay. They're prone to false positives. They lack really adequate scientific evidence to support their general clinical use, and they require expensive equipment at times. So as a result, they have not been widely adopted. Therefore, the new philosophy that is now being taught is to change the dentist, the mindset of dentists and all of us to begin to focus on primary and secondary caries. That means to prevent caries altogether or to arrest white spot lesions and to keep them from developing into full-on cavities. So many dental clinics have stayed open during COVID for emergencies only, mind you. But now, depending on where you find yourself in the US, clinics are either open already for weeks and are fully operational from day one, very busy, to others that are in the process of planning to go back. So what I'm gleaning is that the outlook for dentistry is already more positive than originally expected, as for example, reported by the popular Dr. Bicuspid. So among the biggest concerns are safety, costs, and staffing. So the challenge, of course, is that complete patient and staff protection is not possible. And there are a host of dental oral evacuation devices that are available to clinics that they can purchase and then use to suck air away right beside dental cleaning and surgical procedures. But it would appear that there's not much available data to really show how effective these are. And I think what this means that, dentists already know this. They fear that after spending a bunch of money, that they may end up in their closets. So then there's the
Stephen, have you heard anything from like your conversations with Dom or others in terms of the usage of PPE? Because I think one of the impressions that we got, in the hospital systems when everything hit, you didn't expect to walk into every single room and put on PPE under normal circumstances, but now folks were having to do that. But dentists sort of had to do that at some level anyways. Are you hearing any rumblings one way or the other as how big of a change this is for them? Is this like we're going to increase what we're doing by 10 or 20%, or is that really not part of the discussion at this point?
Well, they're certainly using a lot more of it, face masks and everything else. They have to adapt. Some use the magnifying loops and other things and lights. And so it has taken some effort, but they've just really taken like a fish to water because they're already used to using all of that material. And in fact, new companies are putting out new products. So where some companies don't like, some dentists don't like to use the rubber dams, new ones are coming out that are more convenient. So things are changing, adapting. And, but of course, the extensive use of PPE adds cost and is generally very uncomfortable. I mean, I've never actually worn one, but everybody tells me that these N95 masks are difficult to breathe. They leave marks on your face when you wear them all day. They're hot. And all the extra gear causes excessive sweating. So the other challenge is that, of course, some of the staff is staying out on unemployment benefits, and some even are making a better income doing that by staying away. And one of our dentist friends told us just recently that their hygiene staff is now managing their front desk, which is, of course, an ineffective use of clinic staff. But I think, frankly, all of this was expected to largely return to normal fairly soon. Now, per the current CDC guidelines, examinations must actually be left open for 15 minutes between patients. Every time aerosolizing instrumentation is on, which of course has an impact on scheduling. And some clinics are now forced to increase from 4 to 5 to 7 days per week. Nevertheless, what I'm seeing is that there's a general optimism that dentistry will rebound quickly. And most dentists fundamentally believe that dentistry was safe to begin with. And they also recognize that PPE only goes so far, and it primarily comes down to really thorough infection control. So I think the key that they've recognized is safety, efficiency, speed, and economics for both patients and the dental clinics, but who are both hurting financially. So I think timing was always important, and it's all about dentist chair time. But even that was true even in the pre-COVID times. But now speed will be of the essence, especially, of course, given the uncomfortable PPE. And so the focus will be on getting patients in and out as quickly as possible. So for us at Greenmark, the status quo is not an option. So let's imagine what we could possibly do with technology. In our view, nanotechnology and biomaterials will play a key role. So just to take a little shift now, permit me, I may get carried away, but speaking about my personal passions, I of course love science. I love examples from nature and nanotechnology. And this here represents a splendid miracle from nature. This is an image of, anyone they know, a human enamel, which consists of this rod-like structure, which to me is reminiscent of a Greek temple with these tiny pillars stacked closely together. So we know that enamel is the hardest material in the human body. So even if you tried, you couldn't design it any better. Let me explain. So these tightly packed rods have specific configuration, which has been the subject of much research. So the yellow outlined rod here indicates the configuration of which is called keyhole or fish shaped, with A being the head and B being the tail of the enamel rod. And inside these enamel rods are tightly packed bundles of mineral crystals. And the rods are oriented head to tail. Enamel crystals are, in fact, and this is maybe getting too detailed for most, so I hope I'm gonna stick with me, okay? This is going somewhere. But enamel crystals are composed largely of inorganic calcium phosphate, over 90% of it. And the space between the crystals is occupied by an organic matrix, which consists of proteins that were involved in their original growth and deposition, and then the rest is water. So this is a very interesting cross section. So the tooth is cut, and through the enamel, near what is called the DEJ, the dental enamel junction. It's a common term that dentists use. So note how we see these groups of enamel rods labeled A and B alternate in directions. Everybody knows that if you have a mineral that's brittle and it's all going in the same direction, it's going to crack. Well, this arrangement of groups of enamel rods is reflected in sort of the bands that look like rivers of crystals. And as a result, when we examine this tooth under a reflected light, we see these alternating light and dark bands that appear in enamel. They're called Hunter-Schrager bands that extend from the DJ, sort of about 2/3 of the enamel, and then they disappear in the outer 1/3. So why is that? Well, that's where it needs to be very hard and where it's constantly being refreshed by the calcium in our saliva. So it's very, to me, very intriguing. So these bands are not normally observed on the biting surface of the enamel. And so these Hunter-Schrager bands really reflect this alternating direction taken by groups of enamel rods as they move away from the DJ during tooth formation. And their high crystallinity is critical, and their unique alignment is critical. They have a real purpose that makes human teeth so hard and durable. They have to last our lifetime, ideally. So to me, this is nanotechnology at its finest. So at Greenmark, we're also taking advantage of nanotechnology. So Greenmark's mission is really to preserve teeth through earlier diagnosis and non-invasive treatment. And we transform native starch that's grown by US corn growers into nanoparticles. And then we attach functionalities, a whole bunch of different functionalities that we have available. And we can load things on the inside. So these are not hard mineral rocks, but they actually are what I call nano sponges, and they have a belly where you put things on the inside and attach things on the outside. And so we can target them to go exactly where they're needed. So we can target fluorescent starch nanoparticles so they can detect early stage caries. And we can load them with fluoride as well as minerals inside the particles, and then they can target their delivery to the enamel subsurface so they fill up and restore the lesion in a much more natural way. So the product is a mouth rinse that works on all tooth surfaces. Let me just clarify, it's still pending FDA clearance, and we plan to launch it by Q4 of this year, if all goes as planned. And I would summarize it by saying it's a quick procedure that fits into the standard workflow of the routine dental exam as performed by the hygienist. And then the dentist simply comes in at the end and confirms the results and makes the diagnosis. Now, thanks to a number of NIH grants, we've been able to demonstrate performance on all tooth surfaces. And when this tooth is cut in half, the histology shows us that this smooth surface white spot confirms the presence of an early lesion into the enamel. And this also works extremely well on the occlusal surface where most lesions actually occur. And it has been demonstrated that it also detects tiny lesion areas less than 0.1 millimeter in size. So this is an actual tooth with an early white spot lesion. So the surface normally remains intact because the fluoride exchanges with it. It makes it more resistant, forming this bridge at the surface. But these open microchannels allow acid from sugary foods to seep into the enamel. And as the area becomes more porous over time, eventually becomes so weak that it collapses and a cavity forms. Now, as calcium leaches away, our research has demonstrated that it leaves behind negative charges all over the interior of the white spot lesion. So we simply put the opposite positive charge on our nanoparticles to target the enamel subsurface. And we tag them with a fluorescent dye so they illuminate. We also proved that we can load fluoride and the essential minerals, calcium and phosphate, that are depleted as a result of tooth decay right inside our nanoparticles. So current fluoride products merely seal the enamel surface without restoring the dominant subsurface lesion. But imagine our targeted treatment concept really is unique, and therefore we are developing a product now based on this concept with some additional NIH funding. So our fourth NIH grant involves our targeted treatment, and we have now demonstrated that white spots fade away in 2 weeks after a single application and subsequent exposure to saliva. So the whole idea is that these particles go in, they are targeted to the subsurface, and then they draw on the saliva to bring in the calcium and fill up the lesion in a more natural way with hydroxyapatite, which is really calcium phosphate-like crystals. So we're very excited about this. Mine is still preliminary, but we're working to optimize this product. So this is my last slide, Gene. I think our vision, preserving teeth for a lifetime, is a bold goal, but it represents our way of rallying around ongoing product development and a vision for a world where dentistry has painless treatment options. So we're working, I think, to solve a big problem that will hopefully help make people very comfortable going to the dentist. And our goal is to help dentists find lesions early, repair them non-invasively, and then help them make profit and get back to business and attract more patients to their clinics. So thank you all for listening, and I'm always open for questions, or if you want to contact me directly, you can get my contact through Gene.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really cool. I think it's really timely because as we're having these reopening conversations and how everyone gets back to business, everyone's asking, well, I need to minimize aerosols. I need to do this. I need to do that. And So I think it makes these conversations about non-invasive dentistry really timely. I mean, they're always timely because we don't want to be drilling into teeth, but this is a really good time for it. Yeah, questions? Any questions from the audience? Happy to take some. Stephen can hang around and take a couple questions. Feel free to raise your hand, your virtual hand in the Zoom room. Raise that little blue hand if you have any questions, comments, questions for Stephen that you would like to discuss. What have you heard, Stephen, from some of the advisors that you have in terms of? I was just talking with someone not in dentistry today, but in eye care, and they were saying they've been back to work, at least in Michigan here, for about three weeks. Do you have any idea how long folks have been doing dentistry? It's been like emergency for the most part, hasn't it?
It was actually, oddly enough, not declared an essential service. So dentists were probably not impressed by that, whereas a lot of other businesses were. So that's odd, but in any event, they were there to provide emergency services. Not all clinics stayed open, some closed. And it's very varied across the country is what I'm hearing, is that, in the big cities where COVID is just only recently going down, they're just starting to plan to go back. Other ones in the Midwest where they have not had much and it's been fairly under control, they're already back for 2 weeks and they were busy from day one. So when you go to that link, I can provide it to anybody who's interested. That's kind of a cool early sign that they're saying the current trend, 68% or something like that, is back to business. And if this keeps going, by next month we're at 80%, and this could fairly quickly rebound.
I was hearing again from someone in the eye care industry, and I imagine it's true for dentists as well, that you're being faced with people who now want to get in because they haven't been able to be seen for 3 months, and yet you're being faced with, as you pointed out, some CDC guidance, which actually reduces the number of people that you can have in the office. It actually is going to make throughput harder. And yet you've actually got more people now kind of pounding at your door saying, hey, can we come in and get caught up? So yeah, it's an interesting.
The other comment I could add is that I really enjoyed some of your prior presentations, including the one by Brandon talking about the need for testing and, how quickly we typically forget if you look in history when the events happen. But I think it's critical to keep focus on quick test development. So when it's available to everybody, it's quick. Dental clinics can then go ahead and have a room, people come in, they can test them quickly, and then they only declare seeing people are free of the disease. So that then gives everyone else much more comfort, including, of course, the staff, but also the other patients.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the things we're going to be talking about here in the second session is we're going to be talking about some of the EUAs that have historically happened, because I don't think most people recognize that these emergency use authorizations have happened in the past before, and they're for diseases that most of us have forgotten about. And that's kind of a shame, because we need to remember what history is and not be as unprepared as we tend to be. 10 years goes by and we forget that something has happened. And I think that's going to be a big part of this story going on. But we're thankful for groups like yours that are asking what the future looks like and jumping in when that link is there to be made. So we really appreciate you being with us today, Stephen, and we look forward to your success.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Gene.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Wonderful. Actually, you know what? If Stephen, if you're still there, we did just have one question come up. I'm going to try to allow Ken Spencer to jump on here. If Ken, your question was for Stephen?
Yeah, Gene. So very interesting presentation as usual, And I don't know if in the conversations that you've had recently with Kevin Ward, if he told you that the U of M Dental School approached us a couple of weeks ago about trying to speed up a development for a negative pressure tent for use in dentistry. So they've been working really hard with us on trying to get that done ASAP, so we would have yet a third EUA submission one for the tent, one for the helmet, and then one for the dental tent. That goes a long way in solving, what some of the problems they've talked to us about in terms of the PPE, and also would increase the throughput. We're not that familiar with the dental guys, but they've been great to work with, really helping us out.
Yeah, interesting. If you just Google these oral evacuation devices, all kinds of things show up, and we've seen pictures of makeshift plexiglass hoods on legs and things like that. A lot of which are not going to give the comfort that you think they might give, or they might not give the results you think they might give.
Right.
Tent I had not actually heard of, as you just mentioned, per se, and that sounds very appropriate for dentistry because early on, Don was talking about this already more than 6 weeks ago. I mentioned you're talking about negative pressure rooms like you see in medicine.
Yeah.
Surgery there. That's not really viable for dentistry because we have all these open rooms and examination rooms, and so a tent concept could be potentially much better.
Yeah, you can find it. Gene had our folks on, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Gene, on there.
Yeah, so, 2 or 3, I forget now. Yep.
Really good presentation from Dr. Ben Basson there, and you can see both the tent and the helmet. And we're desperately trying to get the EUA submission approved because the hospital is, going crazy. You're right. The negative pressure rooms, these things outperform the negative pressure rooms 20 to 50 times better. So.
Yeah, that's great.
Ken or Gene, send me a link of this. I would love to learn more about it.
Yeah, we'll get you a link to the video from Dr. Bassender's presentation. And then if you guys have interest in connecting, it's always good to have people working on similar disciplines and who can at least cross-pollinate. And that is the whole point, folks, of MedTech Crossroads. That's why we're here. We're trying to get people to bump into each other for a few minutes. So glad we could do that again today. And thank you, Stephen, for being here. And thank you, Ken, for chiming in with that. Hopefully some good can come out of that. I appreciate you both.
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Gene?
Any other questions? Let's just see here. I don't think I see any other questions. I'll give it another 10 seconds here because we did have Ken's there late breaking. Any other questions for Stephen? Comments, thoughts? Great chance to connect. This is wonderful. I love making these connections. Not seeing any more right now, but if any come further, we will pass them on and put people in touch. So I really appreciate that. Thanks again, Stephen.
Thank you, Gene.
Great. Oh, I love those kind of connections. That's what makes this happen. Next up, I want to talk to you for just a bit about what we've seen with respect to FDA and CDRH, Center for Devices and Radiological Health in particular, throughout this COVID health crisis. And let's just make sure that we are correctly showing up here. Oh, we're not. We're going to do a screen share. Someone will let me know if that's not working correctly, but it looks like it is. So I want to talk about getting to the patient. So we've seen a lot out of the emergency use authorizations in these last months, and they continue. The public health crisis has not been declared over. Still companies working on EUAs, and we hope that history will not repeat itself and that folks will not forget, like in previous times. We mentioned how ventilators were sort of forgotten about for the last 10 years. At the U.S. government had spent $500 million developing ventilators. And then a private company shut that process down when the immediate financial benefit wasn't there anymore. So we hope that this episode, as Stephen mentioned, will have raised awareness. And we want to talk a little bit today, FDA education, about emergency use authorizations, about things called breakthrough device pathways, and a little bit about traditional 510Ks. And I'll just preface it by saying this isn't legal advice. These are highlights. This isn't the whole story. If you want to know more about emergency use authorizations or breakthrough device pathways or 510Ks, you got to get a lot deeper. But hopefully this will give you some interesting comparisons between these methods that FDA uses to authorize devices to get to patients. And this is device focused. We're not focusing here on drugs or really assays, because those will go through different approval processes at different times. So a traditional 510K, this is the workhorse of how devices have been approved in the US for the last at least 30 years. And it's based on the concept of substantial equivalence by comparing your device to a predicate device. And of course, in the past, that led to some abuses where people were saying our device is just like this thing over here. And in fact, it wasn't just like this thing over here. They've reined that in quite a bit. They have a de novo process that goes alongside the 510K process. But the 510K is still an underpinning of how CDRH regulates medical devices. And by comparison to some other things, or maybe what many companies would hope, the review timelines can seem kind of long. On the right side, you see if FDA gets the 510K submission on day one. Now, of course, you've spent months and months and months developing the submission. By day 7, they'll send you an acknowledgement letter or a hold letter. By day 15, they will give you a substantive review, accept you for a substantive review, or place you on a refuse to accept hold. By day 60, they'll have done their substantive review. By day 90, they will try to get you a decision. And sometimes that doesn't even happen by that point, although they've done a good job. That's kind of what a 510K looks and feels like at a really, really high level. But if we go on forward, FDA has tried to do things, and I'm highlighting the breakthrough device pathway, which you may have heard about over the last couple of years. And the goal of the pathway per FDA is to provide patients and healthcare providers with timely access to really medical devices that aren't otherwise available. So if you've got a Me Too device, you don't expect that you're going to get into the breakthrough device pathway. But if you have something that's truly novel and isn't available to patients, and you can make that argument, the breakthrough device pathway is often available. We've done that with folks, and it's really a bit of a sea change. Before COVID, it was one of the first times we ever saw FDA calling us and saying, hey, we haven't chatted with you in about 2 weeks. You want to have a phone call? And so very, very proactive, very, very encouraging interactions. And in addition to those quick sprint discussions, you also get prioritized review on future regulatory submissions, including your marketing submissions. And so if you think about how it's been for the last 30 years, you've had these 510Ks, bridging into de novos. Then you have the breakthrough device pathway coming along and FDA really taking a proactive stance. Now, with the emergency use authorizations, it has been incredibly fast, incredibly quick turnarounds, incredibly informal discussions with FDA. But it's worth noting, this isn't the first time that emergency use authorizations have happened. Turns out that there are still active emergency use authorizations surrounding anthrax and Ebola and enterovirus and MERS-CoV and Zika and others. So most of us probably didn't know that coming in. But to date, those are largely drug and assay related. So to our knowledge, the SARS-CoV-2 COVID crisis has been the place where the devices have really gotten into the emergency use authorization action with personal protective equipment and ventilators and more. And I just want to make a few observations. I think it came as a surprise to some that EUAs are just that, they're emergency use authorizations. They're not a long-term approval of a device. And so if you're a startup and you're still thinking about an emergency use authorization, you really have to wrestle with that question. When that emergency use authorization is pulled, will it still be wise for me to be in the market? Because I'm probably going to have to fall back to something like a 510K submission for my device. One of the things we noticed over the last 3 months that the emergency use authorization reviews were very labeling heavy reviews. Did you say this in your labeling? Did you say that? Did you warn against this? How would the user know to do this? Very usability focused. How is a user not going to make this mistake at this point in the process? And guess what? That's not unusual. That's very typical for a 510K review. FDA is exceptionally concerned about usability and will the clinician and the patient understand the device and use it correctly, because many device failures, as reflected in the MAUDE database and elsewhere, are use case related failures. We did notice too that FDA took an approach of screening many of the applications before they really did a substantive review. And if you remember that 510K list we just looked at a minute ago, there was that refuse to accept checklist. Well, FDA wasn't doing that formally, but they certainly did have you make first contact, and then second contact is often asking for some of the stuff you already provided in the first. I think they were just overwhelmed. Sometimes they did create interactive review templates for folks to work through, and that was often helpful to structure the conversation. But by and large, flurries of emails were the norm for these emergency use authorizations, sometimes very, very rapidly. Remember our friends over at Make MI, Scott Olson summarized for us a few months ago now, how they were measuring in hours some of the back and forth that they were having at the height of the need for ventilator adapters. Now, while it's been more interactive, I think it's worth noting that there probably have been more chances to think, hey, we're there, and then to find out that no, there's actually more questions or FDA wants to revisit a subject. You don't find that quite as much in a 510K review, and this is more a feature of the quick back and forth that the EUAs have had. And I think one thing that's worth noting, the EUAs raised questions that the agency really hasn't had to deal with before. We highlighted last week how on the mask decontamination question, the agency's always held a 6 log reduction, which is like a 99.99999% reduction in bioburden. Well, that's called sterilization. But we heard from many folks, including on these calls, they were having to reuse masks themselves. And so FDA had to think about that and wrestle with that. And while that probably didn't hit in time to make a difference when folks were having to reuse those masks, hopefully in the future that thought process will have now been in place where FDA is, for certain situations, allowing a 3 log reduction, which is just, you get the impression. So in conclusion, CDRH has actually remained remarkably consistent, applying a benefit risk framework beyond the 510K framework when they've had to face these ad hoc situations. That 510K process is still the workhorse of getting devices cleared. So we'd certainly want any companies that are still thinking about EUAs to take it with a grain of salt given where we are in the process. But FDA does have these opportunities for designation that'll help accelerate development of novel devices when you're not in an emergent situation, like the breakthrough device pathway. So I think what we're seeing is the FDA has done a really good job of adapting ad hoc and applying their benefit risk framework in some pretty crazy situations. The staff have done a nice job of it. And what we hope is that vision that FDA and CDRH in particular has had of faster turnaround times and better interactions, we do hope that this exercise of all these EUAs will only serve to increase that flexibility, but we're thankful for that. So just a little bit of education there on FDA clearance routes and what we saw in many of these EUA situations. What we're going to do next is we're going to open it up for Q&A. Your Q&A can be on the things we've presented today. It can be on Stephen's presentation. It can be on any of the things that we've talked about in the past. There may be, again, these sessions are recorded and they're going to be posted up. They'll be popped up into little subsections. But if somebody's watching it and you have a question that you want to get out to the community, there's still a way to do that. So if your question or comment involves COVID, involves medical device development, involves healthcare delivery, we definitely want to hear from you. So go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and we'll take that. Also, we're going to start adding to these sessions. If you come to these and you have a question about medical device development that you want answered, these are going to also turn into office hours. So if you have a question, you want to get a quick answer to it, we would be happy to address those there. I'm going to give it about 10 seconds for any more questions that we may have before we sign off. And we'll certainly take any questions or comments also about the format or other things that you want to see as we make this move from COVID Connect to what we're calling MedTech Crossroads. And with that, not seeing any hands raised, I want to thank you all for being here. Again, this will go up online. Next week, we're going to be hearing some small business legal observations relative to what's come out of COVID. from Gary Kendra from Kendra Law, as well as some announcements about some programs that are being run. So I hope you'll tune in next week at 2 p.m. for MedTech Crossroads. Thanks for being here.